Today's webinar is all about what's the best way to structure SharePoint. We've been working with SharePoint for many years. Microsoft are great at telling you all the things that you can do with the components, but there's also a bit of a gap around how these are joined together. So I'm joined today with my colleague, Ben. Hi, Ben.
Hello.
Ben, who's this for and why should they be here?
Yeah, so this is anyone who is in an IT leadership position that is considering a move to SharePoint, perhaps from a file share or another system, or perhaps they already have moved to SharePoint, but maybe it wasn't done in the most optimal way and that SharePoint is getting out of control. So in terms of takeaways, we're going to run through the link between the purpose of your information, different content scenarios, and what your user audiences are, looking at who is a consumer versus a creator. We're going to talk about some core principles for designing a SharePoint structure, and we're going to talk about best practices for site navigation.
Excellent. Okay, so in terms of a high-level agenda, we're going to start by understanding the basics of SharePoint, so we're all talking the same language. Then we're going to flip it and talk about the business side. What are the scenarios which lead towards people using SharePoint? Given those two and bringing those together, we then start thinking about, well, how do I define sites which support those scenarios? And then with sites, we'll start looking to how do we group those into hubs and what are the logical ways of doing that? And now we've got our hubs and our sites, we need to think about how we navigate around those. So we're going to talk about some best practices and principles about how to set up navigation correctly. So that's today's journey. I think without too much of ado, Ben, let's dive into the basics. You're going to talk about hubs, sites, libraries, folders, lists, and then that will give us the basis for the rest of the webinar.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so starting with sites. Sites are effectively these logical building blocks of how you organize your content. They're how you organize your documents, your lists, and these other elements that we're talking about. And you'll group your sites into sort of different logical entities that we will see shortly. What we're looking at the moment is a communication site. This is typically used for publishing scenarios where we're publishing news. It typically be the entry point of your intranet. We can see you've got links to other resources, navigation elements, etc. So next we have a team site. So this is much more focused on working, in this case, within the marketing team. This is useful for the people in that team that are going to do their daily work. So looking at content ideas, content library, etc. in this case, looking at the upcoming documents or things that they're working on. So this is very much a working place as opposed to a publishing portal. And this is, as I say, using a team site. So as we can see, communication sites very much targeted at those publishing scenarios we'll talk about in a bit. Team sites much more focused around collaborating or document filing. So when we start looking at document libraries, then basically if you're going to put your files in SharePoint, they're going to go in a documents library. Or document library, I should say. And we can see within that document library, it's probably the thing that's going to be most familiar. We've got lists of folders. We can put our documents in folders, move folders around, move documents around as we'd expect. And as we can see on the left-hand side there, that you can have multiple libraries to support the scenarios or use cases that you need within your team.
And I think this is what people will be familiar with when they've been using the OneDrive sync. They'll see this structure replicated on their desktop. So it's often an entry point into document management to SharePoint. Ben, tell me about lists.
So lists, a little bit harder to explain. So basically with a list, I tend to think of where you might have historically used an Excel spreadsheet. Maybe you had an Excel spreadsheet that contained issues, risks, maybe trackers that you're working on. Lists in SharePoint are able to replace that kind of functionality. So as we can see here, we've got a list of content ideas. We can track status of those ideas. We can filter. We can look at open items versus closed. And we can even start to build some simple automations and business processes around, whenever a new content idea is created, send a notification or some approval to someone.
Okay, yeah, often I've seen them used for tasks as well, is a common, or risks. So all those elements around project management, helpful for where lists play a role. Now, we've created our sites. Is there a way we can group these together, Ben, and what's the way we do that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, historically in SharePoint, you used to have this concept of sub-sites. Microsoft are moving away from that. So what we now do is we have our various different sites and we group them together into a hub. So a hub, as we will see shortly, creates this sort of common place with a set of common features we'll talk about. And what we'll end up doing is nominating one of those sites to become the actual hub site itself that connects all of the others.
Cool. Okay. And I'm assuming we can have multiple hubs.
Absolutely. So yeah, as we can see in this case, you might have a set of sites in the European hub, you might have another set of sites in the North American hub.
Okay. And I think we're going to come on later about how we define what these hubs look like. And as you can see, we've got a mix of sites here, so both for communications site as well as for team sites there. Now, that's the basics around SharePoint. Now let's go from the other side and start thinking about the business scenarios, Ben, which drives how we're going to start structuring SharePoint.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about these three high-level scenarios, we've got publishing, filing, collaboration. So if we think about publishing, as we talked about before, it's things like news portals. It might be knowledge, such as maybe a sales enablement site for sales teams that's published to them by marketing. Obviously, things like policies, HR policies, etc. When we think about filing, we're thinking about those kind of document management scenarios, managing contracts, employee records, financial statements, et cetera, any other types of records. And when it comes to collaboration, we're thinking about how people within teams will work together. So it's not just documents, but it's how we interact and manage tasks and communicate with each other. So looking at things like internal departmental collaboration, projects, collaborating across the value chain, for example.
Okay, so value chain's a term that we use internally quite a lot and in our workshops with our clients. Can you just explain what you mean by that? Because it might be a new term to some people watching this.
Yeah, so for me, the value chain represents the thing that the organization does, the service that it provides or the product that it makes, and all of the processes that are aligned across that. So in an organization like ours, a professional services consulting organization, our value chain is very much from selling through to initiating, delivering, and then supporting a project. Whereas if you're in manufacturing, you might have multiple value chains, which could be around the R&D, product development, and then the actual manufacturing, logistics, warehousing, distribution.
Perfect. Okay. So there's going to be scenarios, Ben, where they weren't in that example list, and I'm trying to think what kind of content scenario is it. So I think you put a checklist here to help people guide what that site or what that scenario actually ties back to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, these are kind of rules of thumb as opposed to sort of, strict rules. But if we think about this, publishing, the time frame is relevant now. We're creating content that is relevant to people now, and typically the characteristics are that it's created by a small group of people, perhaps in a support function like HR, and it's consumed by a large group of people, i.e., the whole of the organization, for instance. Okay, so it's a large number of consumers and perhaps a small number of creators. Types of content are going to be quite varied. So web pages, rich text, rich media content, videos, documents, images, etc. And from a governance perspective, we may be seeing things like content review cycles. We may be seeing things like internal approval when news articles are being published, for example.
But I'm guessing it doesn't have to have an approval process. Many organizations we work with, people are empowered and trusted just to publish news without it going through a second check. So
yeah, that's exactly the case. And again, if it's something like an internal comms team publishing out, then they will be authorized to do that already. But perhaps if they've allowed a wider group of people to maybe submit blogs, for instance, then that may need to go through an approval process before it's released.
Perfect. And then the review cycle, keeping things current. So filing, let's move on to this one.
So filing, I tend to think of this as a slightly different thing. This is around a group of people that are filing and tagging things up to make it easier for them to access at a later date and time. So if we think of those employee record scenarios, we're filing them because we have a legal requirement to do so, and we want it to be nicely organized so that at a point in the future, maybe a year down the line, if we need to query something in their contract, that document needs to be really easily accessible. So when we think about filing, the time frame is I'm filing now to be consumed potentially by myself at a point in the future.
Okay.
In terms of the types. Sorry,
Yeah,
go
go
ahead.
on. I was just going to say, I imagine filing is really where metadata adds a lot of value.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Because, while we're working on it right now, we know where everything is. But when we want to find it a year down the line, it needs to be easy. So that's where metadata comes in. And yet, in terms of types of documents, again, it's really going to be documents as opposed to other types of rich media content. Of course, there are exceptions to that. PDFs, Office documents, etc., etc. And from a governance perspective, it's probably more focused around the sort of retention, disposition. We're obliged to keep things for perhaps 7 years, and then we need to dispose of them. We might be needing to consider things like GDPR considerations. And then finally, when we look at collaboration, this is about things like work in progress content and the activities that a team are working on right now. So it's very much focused on in the moment. The audience tends to be teams of people, whether it's projects, working groups, potentially even teams that span across multiple organizations. The types of content could be quite varied. So, anything where we're producing web pages, we may want to collaborate on it. And again, things like task management, lists and trackers. So it can be quite broad in terms of the types of content. From a governance perspective, it's going to be more focused on permissions management, maybe some sensitivity elements on there on classified teams or classified areas. And again, the considerations around how we collaborate with our external parties.
Okay, and I imagine the collaboration documents, they tend to have a shorter lifespan. You tend to be top of mind and know where these things are. So maybe adding metadata in these scenarios is actually going to slow people down rather than speed them up. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that's right. It's, the metadata becomes relevant when we need to refer back to it at a later date. So that's when it becomes a filing scenario.
Okay, that's an interesting point that, we don't just say metadata for everything all the time. There's a right time and the right place.
Right.
Okay, so we've got our scenarios now. And obviously, there's going to be some questions that are saying, do I use an existing site I've created for filing, or is an argument to create a new site? And I know you put some checks in place here on the next slide, which is going to take us through what are the triggers to think, now it's time for a new site, rather than maybe using an existing site. And we talked about in outside of this event, but the number of sites that's appropriate for your organization. And I think the answer is the number. There is no defined number. It depends on the use cases and the scenarios. So, yeah. Ben, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, addressing that point that Rupert just said, don't be afraid of creating lots of sites. It's okay to create sites. If anything, it is problematic if you don't create enough sites and you try and make a site cover multiple things or do more things that it's meant to do. So if we think of these scenarios, the first is if we need to separate out publishing from collaboration. So if I'm in a HR team and I need to manage my employee records, which need to be very sensitive and kept quite secure, but I'm also publishing content for the rest of the organization, such as policies or information about benefits, that's a logical split to say, actually, don't try and just have a single, HR site and use permissions to manage who's got access to what. Instead, create two separate sites, one for publishing, a communication site, and one for filing collaboration, a team site. So the next thing is around, okay, well, let's even take that publishing scenario. Maybe I'm publishing benefits information, but I work across multiple jurisdictions. So actually, it may make sense to have a separate site for UK employees to that from USA employees, because their benefits and their contracts, their terms and conditions may be different. So having a separate portal for them to consume, so they're only accessing the stuff that's relevant to them, creating a site for that makes sense. So if we then start looking at the sort of, the value chain collaboration scenarios, maybe we're working across projects. You might be a construction organization, for instance, that might generate lots of images and everything is spun up as a, you work in the context of projects or jobs and you're spinning up a site for that. Now, one of the advantages of spinning up a site for each project is that when that project comes to its end of life and you don't need to retain that content anymore, it's much easier to archive it and reduce the impact on A, your storage, and B, search results and what other people are having to manage. So creating sites makes sense when you're looking at things like Microsoft 365 Archive, because it only works at the site level and not the file level. And then finally, permissions. So again, if we need different sites have got different teams or groups of users, or maybe one site needs to be shared externally but another one doesn't, that is the natural logical place to be thinking about separating into multiple sites. If we've got lots and lots of complex different permissions and different groups of people all coming into one site, then we need to be thinking about how can we separate that out.
Okay, just want to touch on a few of those points there. So permissions, I've often seen where people have put in separate permissions for document libraries, for folders, and it's fine when someone's there managing it, but if that person leaves the organization and someone else comes in to try and understand what's happening, it's a bit of a nightmare. So I think, you have a principle really that we should be managing permissions at a site level, but yes, exceptions do exist. It's never going to be perfect, but we can try and make it easier. So Microsoft 365 groups, Ben, when I pop into SharePoint and I want to create my new site, I see this screen and then you say, stop, think for a minute. And why is that?
Yeah, it's a good point. So communication sites we're clear with, they're nice. They deal with publishing scenarios. Great. Let's think about team sites though. We've kind of introduced this idea that team sites are for filing and for collaboration. Well, the thing we need to be aware of is that the default team site that Microsoft prompts you to create comes connected to something called a Microsoft 365 group. So a Microsoft 365 group gives you an Active Directory or Entra ID security group for managing user membership. It gives you a SharePoint site. It gives you a planner. It gives you a mailbox and a calendar. So it's giving you quite a lot of things that are very focused on that sort of ability to collaborate. It also is one of the core internal building blocks of a Microsoft team, which we hopefully are reasonably familiar with. Now, if I'm looking at a filing scenario where my principal driver is around document management, and that may be document management across multiple groups in the organization, and there may be some slightly more intricate permissions that I need to consider, then getting this Microsoft 365 group is an overhead that we don't really want. So actually what we're going to do instead is look to create a team site with no Microsoft 365 group. So the way we do that is we click on that option that says Browse More Sites. And then we can see this option for team site. And if you notice if you're able to read the screen, what we're basically saying here is a site for a team of people to share content. This option does not create a Microsoft 365 group, Outlook, Share, Calendar, OneNote, etc., etc. It's not strictly true. You do get a notebook anyway, but so what Microsoft said isn't quite accurate, but we won't worry about that today. So yes, if you're looking at a filing scenario, then you really want to be creating a team site with no Microsoft 365 group. So yeah, as we can see on this, filing only, team site with no Microsoft 365 group. If it's collaboration, then we do want a Microsoft 365 group. If it's collaboration and filing, so if it's the HR team, they want to collaborate, but they want a filing area, again, create a Microsoft 365 group, but be mindful of the difference. And actually, something that is worth bearing in mind is really, if we're creating a team site with a Microsoft 365 group, my first question would be, well, actually, shouldn't we be creating a Microsoft team? Because that really is probably a better use case for collaboration than just a team site with a group.
Yeah, I think a good litmus test, what you always hear you say in workshops is, is there going to be a conversation around this? And if there is, that's really when you start putting a team in there. Filing, it tends to be sort of after the event, fact-based. If a contract is signed, there's nothing more to say. We just need to save it. So that's pretty good. So I'm just going to play back what we've heard there. So when we bring a group in, it's going to bring some additional value in terms of managing through Entra ID, what's called Active Directory. It's going to create a planner for you. It's going to provision a mailbox and the associated calendar, and also ability to convert and connect to a team. So that's the good stuff, Ben. What's the counter to that?
Yeah, so the counter to that is it makes it harder if you want to manage slightly more granular permissions. So in those filing scenarios, maybe think of the scenario where you've got employee records, but you've got some records are for directors and need to be more restricted in terms of who has access to them. So it makes it slightly harder to support that. More considerations are needed when you're using a group. It creates technical overhead. If you don't need the planner and the mailbox and the calendar, and you're not collaborating, you're filing, then you don't need all of that additional stuff. When a site is connected to a group, it cannot be ungrouped. So if you convert a team site to one with a group or convert to a team, that is a one-way action. You cannot undo it. And finally, just something to be aware of is that Microsoft 365 groups, excuse me, only work with team sites. They don't work with communication sites.
And I guess that's because communication is all about publishing rather than collaboration. So that makes sense. So let's just summarize what we've heard in this part of the video, which is the first thing is choosing the right site for the right use case. So publishing, we use a communication site. For filing, we look to create a team site with no Microsoft 365 group. And then for collaboration or collaboration/filing, we look for that team site with a group. And if you're using Microsoft Teams, because I know not every client does, then the argument there is to connect it to a team as well. But then if you're using Slack, obviously Teams isn't going to be an option to you. So that's choosing the right site. Now, we also then moved on to, okay, I've defined the right kind of site, but when do I need to create a new site rather than maybe using an existing site I've already provisioned? So we've talked about the different scenarios between publishing and collaboration. So if you have a publishing site for HR, but now you want to start putting maybe your employee contracts into SharePoint, then you want to be looking to create a new site for that. We talked about the lifecycle management, specifically around projects, engagements, maybe matter, that kind of thing, and be able to close down a project at the end and what happens at that close down in terms of archiving or maybe changing permissions. We also talked about, do I create a new site when I have a new audience? For example, I'm publishing benefits for the US. I've opened up a UK office. They have a different set of benefits. That feels like the argument for a new site. And then we also talked about permissions, particularly maybe if you're creating, say, something like a joint venture and you're bringing in external people, you want to be really clear of what they can and can't access. So these are all triggers for when you should be considering when you create new sites. And part of it is we can consider automation of these sites. So when do I create a new project site? So we can make it simpler using Power Automate and other technical things that I call provisioning engines to help make that happen. So options to do it, but hopefully this will give you a steer on when the right time is to create a site, and when you do that, what kind of site to create. Now, we've created all these sites, Ben. I think what we'd really like to do is be able to group these together. You talked about hubs at the top, so should we just dive into hubs, and maybe you can start by telling us what the benefits are?
Yep, sounds good. So really, I mean, there's a few benefits, but the three key ones are every site in a hub has a consistent branding. So we can see that marked up on the screenshot there. So number one, it will follow the same look and feel across every site in that hub. This becomes relevant perhaps if you have, if you've acquired an organization and they still have their own brand and identity, it kind of makes sense for them to have their own hub with their set of branding versus another part of the organization. The other thing which is really useful is a common navigation. So having this consistent navigation that appears across the top of every site that's connected to the hub is really key. And then finally, a shared search scope. That means if I do a search, I am searching by default across all content within that hub as opposed to content in a different hub.
Okay, so I can see the value in that, because if I'm in a intranet or a publishing hub and I search content, I've got good confidence in that those results, that's been reviewed and approved content. Whereas if I'm in a workspace hub, it could be work in progress. So that makes sense. Or I want to focus on maybe all the client projects.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's take a use case. Here's Bob, for example. He's looking to find out information, and it's the kind of information which might sit in any of these. It might be sort of, for example, bring your own device. Is that a policy? Do I look at IT help? Is it knowledge? And so by using that shared search scope, which you mentioned earlier, one search, and I've typed in BYOD, will bring back any results from any of those sites. So that's interesting. But if I had a separate hub, which maybe was, an IT consultancy, and I'm doing BYOD for a client, that result is not going to come in there. So Bob's going to get the answer he wants about BYOD. So that makes sense. Ben, anything else you want to talk about in terms of how we've grouped these sites together?
Yeah, I think the key thing is we'll see the difference between these two is the intranet hub is very much focused on publishing scenarios. The projects hub is much more focused on collaboration scenarios. So we're separating out the scenario and having a hub focused around publishing content and then a hub focused on collaboration. So generally, as a rule of thumb, I'd try to be looking to separate your hubs and not having your hubs as a mixture of publishing and collaboration, because we're thinking about the audience of this content we're publishing to others, whereas we're collaborating with ourselves and our team.
Okay, that's interesting. And that obviously the question I get a lot is, what's the right number of hubs to have? Is there a target there? And I know that we've worked with organizations from 10, 15 people up to thousands in the enterprise space. So you put some time together here, Ben, to pull together some scenarios. I think there isn't that framework. Part of the I guess the value that when we work with people is to understand what is right for them. But I think with some general rules of thumb, as you say, that we can apply here for small, medium enterprise type businesses, and also you've got some variations here on why that might be different for a professional services organization to a manufacturing organization. So, starting with the tiniest of organizations, micro, but what does this look like?
So realistically, in this scenario, if you're a very small organization, it's probably fine to just have a single hub. So when we first started as an organization, we just had a single hub. All of our sites were there. We still had different sites, that represented the fact that we had HR requirements, we had operations requirements, sales requirements. Now, the fact that actually a single person may be responsible for multiple parts of the organization and accessing multiple sites is not a problem, but they've all been brought together in a single hub. Now, the key thing about this is that even though it's in one single hub, we're still able to consider growth. So as we do become a larger organization, we can then start to separate this out because we've already thought through what the roles and the functions of the business are and pre-created sites for that.
So that segues beautifully into moving from micro to small. So Ben, what you split out here?
Yeah, exactly. So when we start getting a little bit bigger, we're going to start separating out the intranet content from the workspaces content. So in the intranet content, we've got our news, we've got our HR information, we've got our policies, we've got our knowledge content, because again, even though we still may be relatively small, our employees will be wanting to find that published information and know that it's been curated and it's definitive, versus going into the workspaces hub, which is where the day-to-day working is happening. People in HR, people working on projects. But at this point, we don't need to separate out much further than that. It's enough to just have one workspaces hub, and we're recognizing that split between publishing collaboration scenarios.
Okay, and now at this point in our next scenario, we're going to separate services to what we call manufacturing based on some of the projects that we've worked in. And I think the first trigger on the medium organization here is we're now creating a delivery hub, a mechanism here for multiple projects. Ben, what else have we done here?
Yeah, so absolutely. Again, as we're starting to get a little bit bigger, we're thinking about the value chain a little bit more, because there'll be a lot more people, working in, say, delivery, and there may be a whole load of people working in support functions. So by separating out and having a delivery hub, or perhaps a projects hub, for instance, if I'm someone that works on maybe 5-6 projects at any point in time, I can come to my projects hub. It's very much tailored to me, the documents that I'm working on, the recent content. I've got access to my project sites, and I can search across all of my project sites. Whereas someone that is in more of a support function, so again, it may be that someone splits between a couple of roles, someone may be across sales and marketing, they may be in HR, etc. There's a separate support functions hub that isn't going to be pre-populated by or merge with any delivery content. And again, we then have our intranet hub for publishing that everyone's going to have access to.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's the services side, Ben. Let's move on to the other side, which is manufacturing. So this is based on some real cases that you've worked on as in terms of engagements, and you've created what we call product development hubs. So how does that change things? And also we've got this operations hub. So we've moved away from projects and we're talking about procurement QA, for example.
Yeah, exactly. So again, what we're doing is we're recognizing parts of the value chain, or in the case of manufacturing, when actually there may be multiple value chains. So yeah, in manufacturing, if you design and build and develop your own products, for instance, then you will have a whole section of your organization that's focused on the R&D, product design, concepts, etc., and producing these things, and having a hub that's organized around that. Because again, there's still different roles and functions that operate within that value chain, but having all of that grouped together so people across those functions can easily access each other's content becomes really useful. But actually, that's quite separate to the value chain around the actual manufacturing, logistics, distribution, quality assurance that goes into actually shipping those products to customers. So again, people in those operations role will need to have access to multiple parts, and it makes sense to have different sites for those parts, but they're grouped into a single operations hub.
And I think the one thing that we've seen from manufacturing organizations compared with services organizations, they're much stricter in their handoffs and where those boundaries are. So I think that's why we've got separate sites for design versus prototype. Is that fair, Ben?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, right. So that's medium. Now, in terms of medium, enterprise, small, these are very broad brackets, and what we see in our experience is that some large organizations operate as a medium organization because they're not complicated, and some enterprise, and then on the other side, some medium organizations, which might be only a couple of hundred people big, have to set up in an enterprise organization because they've got multiple jurisdictions or other factors which drive that. So let's look at the enterprise slide here, Ben. A lot going on. Do you want to take us through it?
Yeah, so I think the thing that we really want to sort of highlight, the first thing is that we're starting to see some potential separation from the intranet hub into multiple hubs. So it could be, we're creating a news hub now where there might be a whole team or a whole, department that focuses on internal news, employee engagement and well-being, for instance. We have a hub focus on that versus things like a HR portal, for instance, that could be a slightly different focus. And maybe we've got different hubs based on the different regions that we're in and maybe countries within those regions. So the publishing scenario is starting to be separated out. Again, different parts of the organization may be operating at different speeds and have different sort of reporting lines, which means that you can't necessarily take quite such a top-down approach to that intranet area. And again, on the sort of workspace collaboration side, we're starting to see more separation around further parts of the value chain, for instance. Again, we've got some knowledge hubs coming in, such as sales hubs, for instance. So we're starting to see those different concepts of knowledge, publishing, value chain support just start to be split out a little bit more. Now, what we're not doing is simply going and creating hubs for each of our departments, but we're thinking of those scenarios of publishing, filing, collaboration, and then starting to see where the splits need to be based on who manages them. And actually, one of the key things is if you are an organization that's made up of multiple divisions, that becomes a logical boundary with which you separate out your hub. So everyone working in one division, perhaps supported by some group services, for instance, has access to the things that they need.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think the enterprise considerations certainly is that what are the flags which adds complexity? It's multiple divisions or potentially brands. Multi-jurisdiction is a big one. If you're operating across different countries with different rules, these are the things which have us on alert. We also have to be pragmatic as well. So we're not going to be able to design the entire structure from the top down like you can maybe for a smaller or medium organization. We have to start thinking about frameworks and creating spaces for people to operate. And because of that, you need to think differently as we talk about agile thinking. So given those considerations, Ben, do you want to run through the takeaways from this section on the enterprise side?
Yeah, so I think from the takeaways, particularly the enterprise takeaways, really what we're doing here is looking at what that sort of high level group function structure is going to be. So we're thinking we may not design all of the sites, but we certainly would be thinking about what the different hubs within the organization we would want based on those different roles. The boundaries of those hubs are going to be quite often divisional or jurisdictional based. It could be different legal entities within the business or different divisions operating different things. We're going to be creating those hubs to create that high level framework with some governance that localized teams can work in. So what we mean by that is, as we say, we're not going to necessarily map out and define every single site that's required, but if we have those hubs, then we can create governance rules that say if you want to request a site in this region, then and it's based on this use case, then it's going to get connected to this hub. Now we do have a star against that we'll come back to in a second. And then finally, we're still thinking about the keeping that separation between publishing scenarios and that sort of collaboration, filing, doing the work. So the star that we were just going to highlight very quickly is the point that Microsoft themselves don't necessarily give you any specific governance other than some very basic governance around what sites go in what hubs. But this is where tools such as site provisioning frameworks, we have our own site provisioning framework where you can allow users to request a site and it will go and assign that site using the right template, assign it to the right hub and give the right people access to it based on a set of rules. So that's where those types of tools come in, and there's a number out there.
Okay, and so real life use case, I'm a project manager. I can request a project management site for my project documents, and that will appear in the projects hub, but I won't be able to create something in the policies hub, for example.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, Ben, at this point, actually, we had a question come in, so I'm just going to read it out to you, and maybe you can help us with the answer. The question is, so are hubs based on collaborations rather than static departments or business units?
Yeah, so are they based on collaborations versus static departments or business units? So I think, yeah, the key thing really is that we're looking to not just simply replicate your departmental structure. They're based on the functions and the processes that the organization operates realistically. Yeah? So yeah, as I say, don't fall into the trap of saying, okay, this is our organizational structure. We're going to create a hub for every one of those departments with a mixture of publishing and collaboration. What we're looking to do is think about what are the portals and the areas that people need to consume content, knowledge portals, news. What are the areas that people need to work in across that value chain, whether it's delivering projects, whether it's making products, whether it's distributing products or other types of services. So think of the use case as opposed to the department structure.
Okay, so thank you for answering that question. Let's move on to navigation. We've created hubs, we've put sites in there. We now need our users to be able to find the information that we've created and navigate around all these sites, Ben. So starting principles, I know that, when you look at navigation, you talk about the consistency. So if I'm moving between hubs and sites, I still know where to find things because we structure things in a similar way in terms of navigation. I think we're going to see this in a second. The second point is thinking about who's actually going to use this navigation, the consumer's information. So let's talk about news. We're probably more focused on the people who are reading the news rather than the small number of people who have to create news. And I think the third thing, and this probably comes back, is that it's not just replicating the hub and the hub and the folders and the list structure that you have within SharePoint, but it's actually pointing to the assets that people need to access. So it could be pointing to a file about or a doc page around new joiners rather than pointing to the document library of HR help documents. So given those principles, Ben, I'm going to bring up the demo environment. Maybe you could talk us around what we're seeing here and what navigation's been set up.
Good. So yeah, looking at navigation, I think there's a couple of things just to introduce here. The first thing is the app bar on the left-hand side. So this is relatively recent. I think maybe in the past 18 months, possibly. I lose track of time, but yeah, relatively recent addition from Microsoft. And what this is really is a sort of personalized view for the individual. So as we go down, you'll see things like my sites, my news, etc., my files, yeah. But what we see at the top is the sort of home tab, which is representing a navigational structure that can be defined. If we just expand that, maybe if we expand the intranet, so we'll see that structure there. Now, interestingly, what this is doing is actually replicating the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is the hub navigation. So if you just come out of that a second, so now if you just hover over that intranet nav there, so yeah, we can see that what was being pushed through into the app bar is actually representing this hub navigation, which is the consistent navigation that sits across all sites within this particular hub. So this scenario, as we talked about before, is a publishing scenario, and so all of the navigation around this is focused on that publishing content, and then we're going to go and take people off into those workspaces, which are over, representing the different parts of the value chain. So the key thing is that hub navigation is consistent across any sites connected to it. We'll just go through another couple of points before we start talking about some of our principles around navigation. So yeah, and you can see if there's other hubs, we can see on that right-hand side, we're taking people off to those other hubs where relevant.
And that's something that we've created, Ben, rather than SharePoint doing automatically, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. These are our principles as opposed to SharePoint doing this for you.
Okay.
So it is just worth highlighting what we can see at the moment. So within the sort of pink banner there, we are looking at the site navigator. It's technically called the local navigation, but it's effectively your site level navigation. If you've been working with SharePoint for a very long time, you'll have heard it referred to as the quick launch historically. So the thing about the local navigation is that this really is about navigating within that specific site itself. I try and discourage you from putting links in that site that are going to take you out of that site to other places. You can use other links for that. Okay, so within that navigation, it's very much navigating around the site. If you were looking at a team site, then that local navigation would be appearing down the left-hand side. There are, you can actually swap it around technically, even in communication sites, but the general principle is publishing sites, communication sites, local navigation is at the top, team sites, local navigation is on the left. And then finally, we've got other tools like quick links or calls to action web parts. So on a page itself, we might have links that are going to go and take us off to other places. So this is still technically a form of navigation, but generally the principle here is we're referring to specific tools or third-party apps that we're going to navigate people to away from the site. So that's what we tend to use the quick links for.
Okay, obviously a lot going on here, particularly with the hub nav. So I know you've got some principles on that then, which might be useful for people to see.
Yeah. So my principles that I tend to recommend to people, this is not a Microsoft guideline. This is our experience and our guidelines really, is that when we're thinking about our hub navigation, we kind of take a left to right principle, which is that everything on the left is focused on the content that's available to everyone, and then we start to narrow down based on the use cases. So if we've got a scenario where we've got one of those smaller organizations where everything is in one hub, for instance, then we would sort of follow this principle even more so. So on the left, we've got our publishing content, everyone can access that. And then we might start narrowing in, maybe it's slightly more restricted publishing, so maybe knowledge portals relevant to some people versus others. So it's publishing relevant to everyone, restricted or more narrowed audience publishing, not necessarily relevant to everyone. We're then getting into the filing scenario. So that's not necessarily about collaboration, but it's about, things like contracts that might be, managed or accessed by multiple people. Governance, board committees, meeting minutes, etc., etc. And then as we're going to the right, we're taking people more into those day-to-day areas that are directly relevant for them, their workspaces, finance, HR, projects, etc., etc. And if we are going to take people to other hubs, then we would go and take them out and have a kind of hub switching component where we can go and switch out to the client's hub or project's hub, for example.
I guess, Ben, the key to all this is keeping this consistent in every hub. So I know if I go to a different hub, there's always going to be publishing on the left-hand side, but I can always switch back to my other hubs on the right-hand side. And I think one other thing that we haven't touched on here is that these links can be audience targeted. So if there's certain people who should see certain links, you can tie that back. Is that to a Microsoft group, is it, or an Entra group?
Yeah, it's basically any security group or Microsoft 365, you can make it visible. So, maybe people don't see the internal projects link, or they don't see the HR workspace if they're not a part of that group. And just to be really clear, I know we're saying publishing on the left. If I'm in a collaboration hub that's pure focuses on collaboration, yes, we may but not have publishing on the left, but we're still thinking about everything on the left is stuff that everyone has access to, and then everything on the right is where it's more narrowed down and becomes more relevant to the individual.
And so in a global organization where you're empowering other divisions or areas to create their own, fill out their own hubs, providing this kind of governance and structure will help drive some consistency across the organization without you having to know every single link. Okay, so I think that was really useful and nice to see, because there's so many ways you can do links. So takeaways from that section. The first thing we looked at was the app bar. So the app bar is on the left-hand side, and you have the flexibility to choose where that navigation is pointing to, whether it points to a site or whether it points to your hub navigation. And we said actually hub navigation is the right thing to do for that. So moving on to the hub navigation itself, try and keep it consistent across all the sites. It's okay to deep link into destinations such as assets, maybe documents, pages, or parts of the site which people are going to find most useful. And then we talked about that left to right principle, about things on the left being accessible to everyone in a published scenario, and then moving across, we talked about restricted publishing, and eventually getting to the collaboration area with filing in the middle. The last thing we had on the navigation was the ability to switch between hubs. So SharePoint doesn't offer that out of the box. That's why we add that in there, for that ability to move between the hubs easily for end users. Now we get down to local navigation. This sits within the site. Keep it simple. You've got a lot of navigation going on already. Generally keep the links also pointing within the site as well. And then the other kind of navigation we have is quick links, which you saw on the right-hand side. That's those 8 boxes. Also gives us a call to action option as well. So you might be linking to apps or other resources, or it's a great way to start a process such as submit a marketing idea or a request, something along those lines. So many options open to you, but hopefully this gives a steer of how we use them and a practice that we apply. Now, Ben, we've seen a lot of things. I think it's time we should have a demo and start bringing this whole story together.
Yeah, sounds good. So Rupert, if you're happy to fire up the demo environment, let's take a look. Works actually. So if we look at this site here, we're in our intranet hub. Now, Rupert, if you were to maybe just do a search for benefits, for instance. So what we can see when we've done a search for benefits, we can see that that search scope has been pre-filtered to any content within the intranet hub itself. So what that means is that I'm not going to be getting anything on a particular project. Maybe if I'm in HR and I've got a work in progress area in my support function, I can see that it's been pre-scoped to say anything that's connected to the intranet hub, and I can see the content that's coming through. Just if, for sake of argument, can you always click on the organization link a second? If you click on that. So if I go back a level, I'm now effectively going to be searching across every site in SharePoint. So you've always got that option, but the default is when you do a search from a hub, you're going to be pre-scoped to that hub. So let's just go and take us out of that. If you click on the back arrow on the search bar there. So that's great. And I think just a quick example, we spent a lot of time talking about the communication site. So maybe let's just go into our HR site a minute. Just have a quick look at what that looks like a second. So we can see, in this case, the example of a team site that we've set up that actually is in fact connected to a Microsoft team. We're not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but we have effectively tailored the default team site experience to make it a bit more user friendly than what Microsoft give you out of the box. We've got our employee records area, we've got our working documents that would be connected to Microsoft Teams. We're using the save for later web part, that my favorites point over the right hand side. And we've brought in things like the My Feed, which is basically a rundown to that user of what they're doing. If you're in a meeting, you'd see that information. You can access your favorites, etc., etc. So that's just a quick overview of when you go into that HR site. Now, should we jump over and have a look at the process of switching over to our projects hub a minute?
Yeah, so a couple of ways. I can do that here, or I've also got my navigation down here. And it's replicating the same as you said earlier, Ben. So I can go to my hubs and click onto my projects hub.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we're in our projects hub, and we can see just the way that we've kind of organized the components here a little bit is we've made it much more relevant to the user. So we've got things like my recent documents that I'm working on. I've got my frequent site. So if I work across multiple project sites, I can see that. I've also got my save for later or favorites web part, and I've got my feed. Now, let's say I want to do a quick search for some content here. So I'm going to do a search. If you could just search for Contoso, Rupert, just because you've got some demo content there. If you're familiar with Microsoft, you're familiar with that. So I've just searched for Contoso. And again, this time around, my search scope is to come back with content that is pre-scoped to the Projects Hub. So again, I can see across all of the different projects that I'm working in, anything that represents that term is going to come through in that way. So Rupert, if you want to just come back out of that search a second. And then I think the final thing we'd do is perhaps if in my frequent sites, could you just click into Project Indigo, please? And we just take a very quick look at a team site in this particular case that's organized around a particular project. So very, very similar to what we saw in the other context, but we might have things like internal project updates that we might want to share, the notebook, the My Favorites. Now, in this particular case, there's nothing in the My Favorites because we've actually scoped it to say I'm favoriting content that's relevant to this project itself. I can see recent project documents, etc. So I think that just gives you a quick overview of what happens when we have multiple hubs, how we can use that search to narrow our results and make them relevant based on the context that we're in, and then using that hub navigation, how we can switch from one hub to another. And as you can see in this case, the hub navigation is a bit more simplistic, but I can always get back to the intranet if I need to.
Like this. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So great demo, Ben. Thank you for sharing that with us. Let's do a quick summary of what we've seen today. So we ran through the basics, talking about hubs, communication sites, team sites, and how document libraries and lists form part of those sites. We then quickly moved on to content scenarios, collaboration being a team site, filing also being a team site, but without a Microsoft 365 group, and publishing being a communication site. We then started to look at when we'd use those kind of sites, a bit more detail on Microsoft 365 groups. We talked about what are the triggers for new sites, such things as the site lifecycle in terms of projects, maybe new audiences in terms of, say, benefits to different countries, or unique permissions, maybe when you're working with external parties rather than internal parties. So all these things can trigger new sites. Then moving on, we thought about how do we bring these sites together, and we showed an example of intranet or a publishing area, communications area being one part, an operations or back office area, and then a delivery area for where projects happen. We also dived into how that might be different from manufacturing, and what are the triggers for creating groups as well. So we looked at maybe potential different divisions or working under different legal jurisdictions. And then the last piece that we looked at in terms of grouping hubs is, do we separating publishing from the collaboration and filing scenarios? Now, bringing all that together and making that accessible is navigation. So navigation is that consistency of, like, from an end user perspective, I shouldn't have to work too hard to find out what I'm looking for. And that left to right principle of showing publishing on one side and moving across to filing and collaboration on the other is how we do that. And then thinking about how we access resources using call to action or other types of quick links there to get people to the things that they're looking for. So that brings today to a wrap. One final thing is, if you're looking for some help with this is what we do as a business. This is our approach to how we take on SharePoint projects. And the bits that we've really been diving into today is the analysis stage and also information architecture, and then taking that information and plugging it into a SharePoint environment, which would essentially be the configuration. So really happy to have a conversation. If you are looking for that conversation, this is the best way to do it. Jump onto our website and click book a discovery call, and you'll have a 30-minute session with myself. But otherwise, I think that brings us to a wrap. Ben, thank you for your time.
Yep, thanks, Rupert.
And I think there's a few more webinars to do on the back of this. So looking forward to the next one. Cheers. Goodbye.
Yep. Cheers. Bye.